welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking with P. O'Connell Pearson. She is an author and an educator, and her book, We Are Your Children Too, will be published in January of next year. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So people who know you well call you Patty.
They do.
And it's been a pleasure for me to get to know you. We recently met.
Yes.
And so even though we live in the same city, Fairfax City, making your acquaintance just opened up this whole vista on the work that you do around creating narrative nonfiction for young people, which is something very specific. So I'm interested in, first of all, what brought you to doing this kind of writing and why you have chosen to focus on the lesser known stories of history.
Well, I started as a history teacher, high school history teacher, and I taught in Fairfax County for 25 years. And then I did in the private sector, and I was writing curriculum and materials, which was good because it was a wider audience, but at the same time, I really missed the classroom. And then I decided I'd always wanted to write. I'd always been writing, and I thought, well, it's now or never. So I went and got an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, in writing for young people, and lo and behold, it worked. And so I'm sort of the Grandma Moses of writing for young people. And I've published, this will be the fourth book, with Simon & Schuster books for young readers. And I always look for the smaller story inside the bigger story. Each of the books, with one sort of exception, has been that kind of story. So I wrote about the women who flew military planes during World War II. World War II, of course, being the big story. And then I wrote about the Civilian Conservation Corps, with the Great Depression being the big story, and the environment. And then I wrote a book about Watergate, which is the outlier. And now this one, in light of the civil rights movement, but perhaps in some ways the bigger story is why we needed a civil rights movement. And this story, which is a Virginia story, but has application to the whole country, about massive resistance to school desegregation.
Well, what's interesting to me is that we are indeed at an inflection point, because there was the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and it seems like we made progress. Then we elected a black president, and it seemed like there was a tremendous backlash, a conservative backlash that started with the Tea Party and has been unrelenting until the murder of George Floyd. And then all of a sudden, it was kind of like that was the straw, the moment that people said something must be done about the state of racism in this country. And in Virginia, and I have lived here all of my life, and my family has lived here for centuries, and so I know the narrative of the Commonwealth of Virginia. You talk in your book about the stories that were told in the 1940s in textbooks. Well, I learned from those same textbooks. I heard my grandmother's stories. So I understand what the Virginia way is.
Yes.
And it is not based on factual truth. It is a small group of people who controlled the narrative, and by controlling the narrative, in many ways, they controlled the future, especially of the civil rights movement. So tell me a little bit about when you started working on this particular book, which is around the closing of the Prince Edward County schools for 5 years. Public education was shut down in an entire county from 1959 to 1964.
That's right. And this was, now, as I say, I taught history in the Fairfax County, Virginia public schools for 25 years. And I did not know this story. And I taught American history most of that time. And I did not know this story. I had kind of heard about it, that there was massive resistance. And I think we all knew there was massive resistance, and that some school systems in Virginia and elsewhere in the South actually closed their public schools, but not for 5 years. And so what happened in Virginia actually goes back even further than that. And what amazed me was the story of the strike that started all this in Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County is in south central Virginia. It's very rural even today. At that time, Farmville, which is the biggest town there, was 4,000 people. And it was a lot of tobacco farms and timber, things like that. And in 1951, there was a young girl, Barbara Johns. She was a junior in high school, and she had had it with her black high school. It was, of course, the separate but equal era, starting in 1896. Separate but equal was okay, according to the Supreme Court. But it was always separate and never equal. And so there was Farmville High School, which was a nice building, plenty of space, cafeteria, gym, etc. And then there was Moton High School, which was the black high school. They were 2.5 times over capacity. There were almost 500 students in a building that was designed for 175. There was no cafeteria, there was no gym, etc., etc., etc. And part of, they had built these little classroom spaces adjacent to the building to help with all the overcrowding. And they were referred to as the shacks, the tar paper shacks, and people from outside called them chicken coops. They were plywood with these tar paper roofs, and they leaked. They were dangerous. They had pot-bellied wood stoves, freezing in the winter, burning up in the summer, etc. And she just had it. And so she complained to a teacher, and the teacher said, well, why don't you do something about it? And she thought, what could I possibly do about this? The parents and the black community had been going after the school board for 10 years to do something about this. And so she very quietly, telling absolutely no one, organized a student strike. Got a small group of people she trusted together, told no teachers, no administrators, because she didn't want them to get in trouble. And 1951, in the spring, they walked out. And she got the entire student body to do it. And the next day, the NAACP, lawyers from Richmond came to Farmville and said they would represent them in a lawsuit against the county if they would sue for desegregation.
And not just a new
not
building.
Not just a new building, which is what they were after. And that was because the NAACP had recognized that the separate but equal never worked. And so the kids debated this, and they decided to go along with it, and they convinced their parents to go along with it, which was horrifying for a lot of these parents because they're looking at losing their jobs possibly, being thrown off their land or out of their homes if they didn't own them. But there was a core of people there in Prince Edward, blacks, who owned property. They had farms. They had less to lose. And so there was enough support, and they had a big rally. They had 200 signatures, and they became a lawsuit for desegregation. And that lawsuit became one of the 5 lawsuits that were umbrellaed, which we know as Brown versus the Board of Education. They came from 5 different places, and the one that was just at the beginning of the list was alphabetical. It was Brown versus the board.
Yeah, because in Prince Edward it was Davis versus Prince Edward, and it was Brown versus Topeka.
Yeah.
And so it ended up Brown v. Board of Education, which is how we know
it. Which is the suit that, of course, all of us know, but it was really 5 suits, all for the same thing.
And more remarkable to me is in your book, which is incredibly well written, well designed, and well laid out, because it is meant for young people. Although as an adult, I read it and thought it was equally fascinating, like you were writing for me. I love the way you laid it out. But at one point in the book, you talk about how 75% of the plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of Education were the students at Moton High School.
Right.
75% of the plaintiffs.
It was the only one of those 5 suits that was brought by students.
It was incredible.
And the NAACP lawyers, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, who went on to become far more famous, they had assumed they would go down there and talk to the kids and be on their way. They were so impressed that they reconsidered and thought, maybe we actually should take this case. And so they did. And so it was the only one that was student-oriented, student-led, initiated.
And I think that's one of the reasons that this book is so different in that, because I interview and talk to a lot of young people who are leaders in their own right. And I always point out that the quickest way to lose your power is to believe you don't have any to begin with. young people, Greta Thunberg has power.
Yes.
You know, David Hogg for March for Our Lives has power. Young people do have power, but they have to first believe that and not let other people tell them they don't have any.
Yeah.
And this is 1951. These are black students in a rural community in Virginia. For Barbara Johns to have believed that she could make a difference is remarkable. And it is a story for the ages.
And this was before Rosa Parks. It's before the Little Rock Nine. It's before any of that. It's before Martin Luther King is famous. It's before Montgomery bus boycott. This happened before they had any of that to look at as modeling for what they did.
And one point I want to make real quick is that Barbara Johns is memorialized both on the Capitol grounds in Richmond, along with Oliver Hill, of Roanoke fame, Spotswood Robinson, and Reverend Francis Griffin. And he is another key player in this whole story. They are memorialized on the Capitol grounds in Richmond, but recently the U.S. Capitol replaced Robert E. Lee with
Barbara Johns.
Barbara Johns. And so here this young woman goes from trying to make a difference in her small community to being, along with Rosa Parks, one of the few women who has a statue in the U.S. Capitol. And that is quite a remarkable journey, too. And I just, before we go to our break, I just want people to understand that if you've not heard this story before, you might be going, like, who is Barbara Johns? I'm sure a lot of people are like, how could we replace Robert E. Lee? Who is she? But the fact of the matter is she was important in 1951, but she also did not graduate from Moton High School.
No. A white neighbor of theirs, with whom they were very friendly, they lived on a farm, and came over and said, I'm hearing threats against Barbara. So they sent her to live with her uncle, Vernon Johns, who was a rabble-rouser.
In his own right.
And he was the pastor at the Dexter Avenue church that Martin Luther King would then become pastor of. And so she went there and finished high school there. She did not finish
at Moton High School.
Moton High School.
And yet she is still a hero here in Virginia.
Absolutely.
Hold that thought. When we come back from our break, we are going to be talking with Patty Pearson. She is the author of We Are Your Children Too, and it is the story of the closure of Prince Edward County's public schools for 5 years. So please stay tuned and join us after the break.
Caitlin, be serious. No, take the oath. Come on. I'm totally taking this seriously. Okay, I'm ready. You may begin. I pledge that I will never meet in person with anyone I first met online without checking with my parent or guardian. And furthermore, if my parent or guardian agrees to the meeting, it will be in a public place and my parent or guardian must come along. Do you pinky swear? I do.
When you teach your kids about internet safety, they'll pass it on. For more information, go to cableclicksmart.org.
Get it.
Get it. Get it.
Give your town a reason to celebrate, because every Goodwill item you bring home brings job training and more to your community. Goodwill. Bring good home.
Your blood pressure numbers could change your life. Talk to your doctor about creating a plan that works better for you. Start taking the right steps at manageyourbp.org.
Maria, so how's work?
It was fourth period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bell and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year, I might get to go.
Cool.
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking with Patty Pearson, who is an author and an educator, about her new book, We Are Your Children Too. So, Patty, when we broke off, we were talking about Barbara Johns and the fact that she is memorialized in Richmond and now also in the U.S. Capitol, and a lot of Virginians
will be. It's
will
not done
be.
yet.
Not done, but they voted on it,
Yes.
so that replacement will take place. But a lot of Virginians may not know who she is. In the book that you wrote, which is for young people, to me as an adult reader, it was so well organized in that you had timelines, because we're talking about a span of 1951, actually before 1951, and then all the way to 2020. And so you have summaries that go by year and the months and sort of these little summaries, and then you launch into stories. The people, you've got so many original sources, people who lived through this, people who were younger, people who were teenagers, people who were adults, in that sort of filling in how it all came about. So you have such a wonderful story arc, and yet the underpinnings are exactly the timelines of what happened. So when you started, is that how you write all your books, or is this?
No, they all have timelines, but usually it's just back matter, just as a reference. But this one covered such a long time period that I suggested, and they said yes, that we really need to break that up, that it needed to be one section at a time so that we could see what was going on between 1951 and 59 when the schools closed, because it's a chaptered story. Right. So you have Barbara Johns. After Brown versus the Board is decided in 1954, all the southern states just delayed and delayed. Prince Edward County really delayed. And finally, the Supreme Court came back in 1959 and said, you have to open these schools in September, and they have to be desegregated.
But they didn't say anything about quality of education.
But that's 1959. So within days, the county supervisors vote not to have public schools.
To just close them down.
Just not have public schools anymore.
And that's when we discovered that the federal government at that time could not force a state to actually provide for public education. It's one of those things like you don't know where the holes are until something happened and you're like, wow, that to me was another remarkable part of this story.
They had lobbied to actually change the compulsory education law, because if there's a compulsory education law, you have to have public schools. You can't force people to pay tuition. So they had that law changed. And therefore, they didn't have to have a public school. They didn't put any tax money toward public schools. And come September, they scrambled and opened what was known as a segregation academy. And they popped up all over the South as well. But they even figured out a way to use taxpayer money, some of which was being paid by black residents in Prince Edward County, as tuition vouchers to the white segregation academy. So there are families in Prince Edward, black families, who are paying taxes, that are paying the tuition for white students to go to a white academy while their own children have nowhere to go at all. And that's what went on for 5 years. And the efforts on the part of those families and that community to educate those children were just
extraordinary.
Extraordinary and heartbreaking.
It really is.
To send your 6-year-old to live with relatives she's met a handful of times in New Jersey, 400 miles from home.
And with total strangers, Quaker families, Iowa, Massachusetts.
The Quaker, the Friends, had a social organization. They found these host families to take a student here and there. They went as much as 1,000 miles from home, having grown up in a rural area where people didn't travel a lot.
Right, and it's the rural deep South, and suddenly you're in Iowa, or how about Massachusetts? And you find yourself the only black student in a white school. Like
having never gone to school with whites at all.
Right, and your accent is different, your knowledge of the world is different, you're not used to urban.
No.
But these kids stuck it out.
And they did amazing things. I mean, these kids ended up going to places like Harvard because they had come from very good education. As horrible as the facilities were, the faculties at many of those black high schools were very good. Because these were people with master's degrees and so forth. They couldn't get jobs at white schools.
Yeah.
and they were doing outstanding work.
And that actually was
under terrible circumstances.
One of the downfalls, or one of the lesser-known facts of Brown v. Board of Education is with school desegregation, so many black educators lost their jobs because they were not hired in integrated schools. And so that has impacted the number of people of color choosing education since that time.
And it decimated
1950s.
these small rural areas, their middle class. That was the bulk of the black middle class were educators.
Right.
And now they scatter. They have to go all over the place to find jobs. But those people worked, and nobody worked harder than the pastor of the Baptist church there. And he didn't really want to be there in the first place. He'd come to take over for his father for a short time, and
and then he's going to leave, only he never left.
Never left. First, the church needs him when his own father had died, and then this situation occurs, and he was passionate about education. His kids joked that they couldn't find a place to sit in their house because everything was piled with books. And he's the one who brought in volunteer groups and helped set up these training centers in the summers and everything he could think of, and continuously lobbying. He was very active with the NAACP, and he's lobbying and lobbying in Washington, and finally then in 1963, the federal government works a way that they are not establishing a school, but they give expertise and so on to get a free school opened with private donations.
In the free school, it was an experiment. I believe in the community school model, first of all. But that free school was something that had never existed before. As you said, it was private donations. People came from all over the country to help. The quality of education, the way they scrambled for textbooks and materials, but everyone was all in. In fact, Reverend Griffin's own son, who would have graduated, he was a rising senior, would have graduated from a high school in Lynchburg, came back his senior year. To me, that speaks volumes about his son's commitment to not just the movement, but to him, that he would blow off his senior year where he had been going to high school to come back to the free school. But that was the sort of credibility, because they needed white families too to join. And so
and that was, you said Griffin, and his son did as well, but it's Gordon Moss.
Gordon Moss's son, you're right, Gordon Moss.
He was a professor at Longwood College, now university, history professor, had been there for 40 years, pillar of the community, treasurer of the Episcopal Church there, had grown up a segregationist, and then had the courage and had the wherewithal as a human being to question himself, to question his own beliefs and the way he had grown up, and changed. And I think that was the difference between him and several other whites in that community and the people. A lot of people thought it was like 5 or 6 white men who were really behind this, as he called it, unintentional evil, was that ability to change the way you think, willingness to take that on. He suffered tremendously by taking that on and standing up for education for everybody and so on, because he did get fired at Longwood, but he ended up teaching all freshman classes as a tenured 40-year professor. Just doesn't work that way. He lost his position at the Episcopal Church. He was shunned in the community.
The retaliation was real. I mean, for black families, they always knew that people could come in the night, burn your house down. In fact, the Johns family home was burned to the ground in a mysterious fire. So the threat of losing your life for the black community was real. But for those in the white community, there were the subtle ways and the overt ways in which you were retaliated against, shunned, and so to not conform to what this handful of men had decided was going to be the white segregationist way in Prince Edward County did take a lot of courage. And Gordon Moss, you're right, it was his son who came back because they needed some white families who were hesitating to enroll their kids instead of in the private academy. And we should point out that the students, and you address this in your book, the students at the private Prince Edward Academy also were scrambling the first few years because they didn't have a building.
Right.
You know, they were in church basements, and so those students also have their own memories of not understanding why this was happening.
Yes, they've been going to a very nice school, and now they've got no equipment, no gym, no nothing.
You know, it was all just things happened to them. And in talking to these residents in adulthood is really heartbreaking, because it impacted not just their lives, their opportunities for better jobs, living wages, jobs, but their children, because many of them just didn't have a foundation of literacy to even be able to help their own children later. And we don't think about the generational impact of that kind of trauma. And to me, what we're talking about is the trauma that was inflicted on poor whites and the black residents of Prince Edward County, that to this day reverberate.
Absolutely. Yeah, the reading rates and so on in the Prince Edward County schools are lower than the state average. And there's no way to know absolutely that it's because of this time period, but I think that's a pretty logical conclusion, that you had all these people grow up with poor skills, and then their children
and sometimes here in Fairfax County we lose sight of the fact that the largest part of the budget in the county and the city of Fairfax go to education. And there's a reason for that. The people who move into these communities, into our communities, value education.
Yes,
they come here because they're educated themselves, and they come because the schools are good and because they value public education. And we should not lose sight of that, because you drive just 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours away in Virginia, and the same quality and resources don't exist.
Are not there. And it makes a huge difference. It really does. And I will say Prince Edward County has done a tremendous amount in the last 20 years or so to try to ameliorate what happened.
And they are addressing it. Your book is coming out in January. There's been another book that was written. Kristen Green wrote a book in 2015. So it's being addressed. Moton High School is now a museum.
Yes, it's wonderful.
And they have all kinds of programming, so that's a start. And for people who are interested in having you address their organizations, you actually speak to a lot of adult groups.
I do, mostly adult groups.
Right.
Lots of civic groups and book clubs, women's clubs, libraries, etc.
So people should reach out to you, right?
Sure.
So,
absolutely.
So for those of you at home, I hope you've really enjoyed this conversation with Patty Pearson and her new book coming out, We Are Your Children Too. And we'll reach out and ask her to address your community organization, your faith group, your book club. And this is what you need to know.